Imagine you are a modern Viking, not the Hollywood version with the horned helmets and the roaring berserkers, but someone who lived in a fjord-cut landscape where the sun vanished for months and the sea could swallow your entire family in a single white squall. You wake up one morning in the year 900 and something, on a farmstead near what is now Oslo. The freeze has cracked the beams of your longhouse again. Your father died last winter because the harvest failed and the meat ran out. Your neighbor's son was taken by a fever that turned his skin yellow, and you have a question that sits inside you like a cold stone. Why? Not in the modern sense, seeking a biological mechanism or an economic cause. You ask why the way a child asks why a wolf is hungry. You assume a will behind the disaster. You assume a personality behind the storm. And you assume that personality can be bargained with, appeased, or at least understood. The answer your ancestors gave you was not a simple one. It had no single god of sunshine and reward. Instead, the Norse pantheon was the only major religious system in history where the gods themselves were doomed. Odin, the All-Father, spends Ragnarok fighting the wolf Fenrir. He knows he will lose, he knows he will be devoured, and he goes anyway. Thor kills the world serpent Jormungandr, but its venom poisons him, and he collapses dead after 9 steps. Freyr, the god of peace and fertility, has given away his magic sword for love, so he faces the fire giant Surtur, unarmed, and perishes. The structure of the entire belief system is not a heaven you earn. It is an apocalypse you walk toward with your eyes open. Now ask yourself, why would anyone worship a god who is going to die alongside them? Why craft an entire religion around losing the final battle? Start with the evidence in the ground. Archaeologists have excavated over 2,000 cremation graves from the Viking age across Scandinavia, from the famous ship burials in Oseberg and Gokstad to the simpler mound, burials scattered across the Swedish countryside. The bodies are arranged with weapons, tools, and sacrificial animals. In the Oseberg ship alone, excavated in 1904, 2 women were buried with 15 horses, 4 dogs, a fully furnished wagon, and elaborate textiles. The point of these goods was not decoration. It was a contract. The dead carried their status and their material wealth into the afterlife, because the Norse worldview did not separate the sacred from the physical. There was no spiritual realm detached from earthly reality. The soul was not a ghost that floated free. It was tied to the body, to the grave goods, to the story your community told about you. To worship a god who dies is not a contradiction in this framework. It is a mirror. The gods were subject to the same laws of fate, the same decay, the same dark horizon as the farmer whose sheep froze in the spring storm. This is where the psychological machinery begins to reveal itself. Think about what a religion of invincible gods would have communicated to a Viking farmer in the 9th century. If Odin were omnipotent and the harvest still failed, the only logical conclusion is that Odin did not care. The universe was indifferent, or worse, malicious. But a god who is fated to fight the wolf even though he knows he will die, that god is a companion in suffering. He is not a master you obey. He is a chieftain you follow into battle. The Norse system solved a problem that more triumphal religions could not touch. How to create meaning in a world that objectively, relentlessly kills you. Not after you die, before you die. Every winter, every failed crop, every child lost before their first birthday. The gods do not promise you rescue. They promise you that your struggle is shared by the highest powers of the cosmos. Now consider the specific date of the earliest carved runes that describe this worldview. The oldest known runic inscription in Denmark, carefully placed on the combs of Vimos, dates to around the year 160. These are not full sentences. They are names and ownership marks. The runes themselves were not just writing. They carried magical weight, believed to be Odin's discovery after his self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil. The god hung on the world tree for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, wounded without food or water, to gain the knowledge of the runes. The act of reading and writing was itself a wound. Every word of the religion is traced back to a god who chose to suffer. This is a foundation stone, the conviction that knowledge, power, and meaning are paid for in pain, not granted through grace. This is not a comforting religion. It is a confronting one, a system that asks you to accept that the deepest truths are carved into you, not handed to you. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden architectures of belief, the ways our ancestors built meaning out of darkness, subscribe to Psi01 and drop the word wound in the comments if you sense that your own deepest understandings have cost you something. Let that stand for a moment. Your alphabet was invented by a god who tortured himself on a tree. Your sacred poetry, the Eddas, the skaldic verses, was composed by a god named Bragi, who was also associated with death and battle. Your concept of honor was so tightly bound to fate that the most admired figure in the sagas is the man who laughs at his own death. Consider Egil Skallagrimsson, the 10th century poet and warrior who, according to his saga, composed a poem called Sonatorek, the irreparable loss of sons, after his 2 sons died. Egil did not beg the gods to restore his children. He did not convert to the new Christian faith, promising resurrection. He sat down and wrote a poem about rage, grief, and the stubborn refusal to break. The gods he invoked were not comforters. They were witnesses. He was performing his grief in front of them, because they too had lost their children. Odin had sacrificed his own eye. Thor had watched his hammer return to him broken. The gods understood, and that understanding was the only comfort the religion offered. This is the first layer we peel back. The question was never literal belief. The Viking did not sit in his longhouse and intellectually debate whether Odin existed. That is a modern, secular framing. The question was existential alignment. Worship was not a transaction. I obey, you protect. Worship was a way of placing yourself inside a story that made your suffering legible. If your son died of fever, you did not ask, why did the gods allow this? You already knew, because fate is woven by the Norns, 3 women who sit at the roots of Yggdrasil, carving runes into the wood. They do not answer to the gods. The gods themselves ask the Norns what has been decided. No one is in control, not even the highest power. That is not a flaw in the system. It is the entire point. Now let us bring in the archaeological evidence that cuts against the modern assumption that Viking religion was primitive superstition. The practice of human sacrifice is documented across the Norse world. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who met a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga in the year 922, left an eyewitness account of a ship burial where a slave woman was ritually killed and placed beside her dead master. Ibn Fadlan describes the scene in clinical, horrified detail. The woman was lifted over a wooden frame, looked into an imaginary doorway, and was then strangled and stabbed simultaneously. The aftermath involved burning the ship so completely that the ashes were covered in a mound. To a modern reader, this is barbarism. To the Norse, it was the highest honor. It was a free woman choosing to follow her master into the next world, a world where status transferred directly. The cost of the ritual was not lost on them. They paid the price of a human life to secure an afterlife alignment. They were not naive about what they were doing. They were making a calculated statement about value. But here's the paradox that modern psychology finds most disturbing. The Norse did not believe in an afterlife of permanent bliss. Valhalla was not heaven. It was a training ground for Ragnarok. Every day the Einarjar, the slain warriors, fought each other to the death, and every evening their wounds healed and they feasted. Their existence was endless preparation for a battle they knew they would lose. The same structure appears in the other afterlife destinations. Hell, ruled by the goddess Hel, was not a place of punishment. It was a cold, gray world for those who died of sickness or old age. It was boredom without release. The best the Norse mind could imagine was a world where you died in combat every morning and resurrected every night just so you could keep fighting. The brute force metaphor is inescapable. Life is a war you cannot win, but the only honorable response is to fight anyway, fully armed, laughing, expecting no reward beyond the fight itself. If this sounds familiar, it should. A version of this worldview resurfaced in 20th century existential philosophy. Albert Camus, in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, describes the absurd hero pushing a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down forever. Camus concludes that the only logical response is to imagine Sisyphus happy. The Norse reached the same conclusion 1,100 years earlier. They did not call it absurdism. They called it courage, and they walled it into their religion, their runestones, their ship burials, and their sagas. The gods do not save you. They die with you. And in that shared doom, there's a terrible, liberating dignity. Here's what this meant for the ordinary Viking, who had no ambition to die in battle. Most Norse men and women died in bed, of disease, accident, or old age. They went to hell, not Valhalla. Did that make their lives meaningless in their own eyes? The grave goods suggest otherwise. A female grave in Birka, Sweden, excavated in the 21st century, contained not just jewelry and tools, but a full set of game pieces and a board. The game was Hennefat Tafel, a strategic battle game where the defending king must escape a ring of attackers. The woman in the grave was prepared for a long wait. She was not expecting a reward of glory. She was expecting a game she could play while the world went on without her. The banality of the afterlife, in Norse terms, was acceptable because what mattered was not the destination. What mattered was how you faced the journey. Now we arrive at the second layer, and this one is more uncomfortable for the modern viewer. The reason the Viking gods were designed to lose was not philosophical naivete. It was a direct response to the environment. Scandinavia in the Viking Age, between 793 and 1066, experienced a climate fluctuation known as the medieval warm period, which made farming more viable but also more unpredictable. The winters could kill an entire population if the stored grain rotted. The sea voyages that defined the culture were so lethal that Viking ships carried no lifeboats. You either made it or you drowned. The average life expectancy of a Viking man who survived infancy was about 40 years. For women, who died frequently in childbirth, it was lower. The relationship between the worshipper and the god was built on the premise that catastrophe was not an interruption of normal life. Catastrophe was normal life. A religion that promised protection from the storm would have been laughed off the fjord. A religion that told you the storm itself was a god who was also drowning, that was a religion you could live by. This is the reality that most modern retellings sand off, the raw, brutal congruence of a belief system forged in a world where catastrophe was not a disruption but the baseline. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden psychological depths, the ones that make the myths mean something, subscribe. Then tell us in the comments, would you find comfort in a god who drowns alongside you, or is that an invitation to despair? The psychological term for this is cognitive congruence. When your lived experience is constant uncertainty, violence, and loss, a belief system that pretends the universe is safe creates dissonance. You can either deny reality or redesign your god. The Norse redesigned. They created a pantheon where every god had a flaw. Odin was wise but treacherous. Thor was strong but gullible. Loki was clever but ultimately destructive. Freya, the goddess of love and war, wept golden tears for her absent husband. No god was complete. No god was perfect. No god could be blamed for not saving you, because they could not even save themselves. This distributed responsibility for suffering away from individual failure and into the fabric of the cosmos itself. If your harvest failed, you did not ask, "What did I do wrong?" You asked, "Which of the gods is having an even worse year than me?" This is the message the Norse runestones carry across 1,000 years of weather and war. On the Ruk runestone in Sweden, carved around 800, the longest known runic inscription in the world, the text does not praise a god. It commemorates a dead son and recounts a series of battles and legends designed to frame the loss inside a cosmic story. The stone says, in essence, your son is dead. Here is a list of other things that have been destroyed. You are not alone in your grief. The stone does not comfort. It contextualizes. It tells the grieving father that the world runs on loss, and that loss is not a failure. It is the price of belonging to a story bigger than your own life. Consider the contrast with the dominant religions of the same period. Christianity, which was spreading through Europe as the Vikings raided its monasteries, promised that a savior had already died for your sins and that belief would grant you eternal life in a perfect world. Islam, expanding from the Arabian Peninsula, offered paradise to the faithful. The Norse had no parallel offer. They offered you a place in a doomed hall, a daily death and resurrection in Valhalla, if you were lucky, or a gray eternity in hell, if you were not. By any objective measure, this is a worse deal, and yet the Norse clung to it for centuries, converting to Christianity only after the political pressure became overwhelming, and even then maintaining their old beliefs in parallel for generations. Why would anyone choose worse assurance over better assurance, unless the price of the better assurance was something the Norse were unwilling to pay? The answer is the core of the entire system. Christianity demanded a specific kind of emotional posture, humility, repentance, and the admission that you were born sinful and helpless. The Norse could not accept that framing because it conflicted with their core identity. A Viking was defined by autonomy within fate. You could not control whether you died in battle or in bed, but you could control how you faced it. A religion that required you to kneel before a power that had already fixed your path and required you to thank that power for its mercy was incompatible with the culture of the thing. The Norse gods were dangerous. They were not kindly. They were not loving. They were big, unpredictable forces that you navigated with courage, cunning, and sacrifice. But at least you faced them standing up with a weapon in your hand. You did not beg. You did not grovel. You made your offering. You said your prayer, and you went to sleep knowing that the storm on the horizon was not divine punishment. It was just the weather of a doomed world. There is a story in the Prose Edda that captures this better than any analysis. Thor travels to the hall of the giant Utgarda Loki and is challenged to perform 3 feats. He tries to empty a drinking horn but barely lowers the water level. He tries to lift a cat but can only raise one paw. He tries to wrestle an old woman named Ellie and is thrown to one knee. Humiliated, Thor leaves. Later, Utgarda Loki reveals the trick. The horn was connected to the ocean. The cat was the world's serpent. The old woman was old age itself, which can conquer anyone. Thor had fought the fundamental forces of the cosmos and almost won. The lesson the Norse gave themselves, through their own myth, was that you measure a person not by whether they win against the impossible, but by how close they come before falling. Thor came within one paw of lifting the world serpent. He nearly drained the ocean. He held old age to a draw before it took him down. That is the standard. The gods themselves were measured by the same yardstick. Loki caused Ragnarok, but he also caused the death of Balder, the most beautiful god, and his punishment was to be bound with the entrails of his own son while a serpent dripped venom onto his face. The gap between the crimes and the punishment is familiar to anyone who has lived in a world where justice is not guaranteed. Now ask yourself a deeper question. Did the Norse believe these stories literally? The intellectual consensus among scholars of pre-Christian Germanic religion is nuanced. There was no centralized church, no creed, no doctrine. Individual communities held localized versions. The Poetic Edda, compiled in the 13th century by the Christian Icelander Snorri Sturluson, is a literary work, not a holy book. The degree of literal belief probably varied, as much as it does in modern Christianity or Islam. But the question of literal belief misses the function. The stories worked because they aligned the psyche with the conditions of life. They did not need to be true in the way a physics equation is true. They needed to be true in the way a dream is true. They organized experience, they gave shape to fear, and they offered a framework for action when action was the only option. This is the hidden layer the modern rationalist struggles to grasp. In a world where you cannot control the environment through technology or medicine, you can still control your response to it. The Viking religion optimized for that. It trained people to expect betrayal, loss, and defeat, and to meet those realities not with despair, but with fury, poetry, and the cold joy of a fight you cannot win. The price of this training was high. It left no room for optimism. It normalized trauma. It created a culture where weeping was acceptable only in specific, formalized contexts, like the Sonatorek or funerary elegies. But it produced people who could stare at the winter and not break. Look at the archaeological record of a single site, the Valsgärde burial ground near Uppsala, Sweden, used from the 6th to 11th centuries. The boat burials there contain warriors laid out with their swords, shields, and horses, but they also contain gaming boards, drinking vessels, and bowls of food. The entire assemblage is a kit for a journey. The journey has no guaranteed outcome. The weapons are there for defense. The gaming board is there for the boredom of hell. The food is for the first part of the road. The dead were sent into the unknown equipped not with answers, but with tools. That is the Viking religious instinct in physical form. You do not know what comes after. You know only that the same virtues that kept you alive in this world, strength, cunning, loyalty, and the willingness to laugh while you burn, will serve you in whatever comes next, even if what comes next is nothing but the mouth of a wolf. This brings us to the third and most uncomfortable layer. The worship of doom gods functions as a psychological defense against the possibility that your life is meaningless. If the gods themselves are part of a tragic story, then your own death is part of the same story. You are not a meaningless speck in an indifferent universe. You are a protagonist in a tragedy of cosmic scale. That is the trade. You trade objective security, the kind that comes from a protective deity, for narrative significance. The suffering is not random. It is a role in a drama. The death of your child is not a pointless biological failure. It is a thread in a tapestry being woven by the Norns, which includes the death of Balder, the fall of Odin, and the end of the world. You matter because your story is entangled with the God's story, and because the God's story is written in blood that you share. Modern neuroscience has a term for this: predictive processing. The brain constantly generates models of the world and updates them based on sensory input. When the input contradicts the model, when your entire worldview says a good harvest follows good behavior, but the harvest fails anyway, the brain experiences a prediction error, which is acutely uncomfortable. You can either update the model or reject the input. The Viking model was brilliantly adaptive. It predicted frequent, catastrophic input. It built the assumption of doom into the base model. When the harvest failed, there was no prediction error. The model was confirmed. This reduced the cognitive load of constant disappointment. You were spared the exhausting cycle of hope and betrayal. Instead, you experienced a grim satisfaction. The world was behaving exactly as the story said it would. The gods were struggling. The Norns were carving. The wolf was coming. All was as it should be. You can feel the weight of that trade, can't you? The Viking model traded hope for certainty, a grim satisfaction that the world is exactly as broken as you expected. If this idea resonates, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, where we'll push deeper into how ancient minds built coping architectures that still run beneath your own thoughts. And in the comments, drop the word doom if you've ever felt that strange relief when the worst finally arrives, and it matches what you already knew. This is the point where the modern reader might feel a chill of recognition. How many of us operate on a low-grade version of the same model? We brace for disappointment. We rehearse worst-case scenarios. We protect ourselves by imagining the catastrophe before it arrives. The Norse took this personal coping mechanism and externalized it into the architecture of the cosmos. They built a religion that was essentially a preemptive strike against hope. They did not believe in a future worth longing for because the future contained Ragnarok. They believed in a present worth defending, a community worth dying for, and a story worth telling. And in that defense, they found something that modern life struggles to provide: a clear, unembarrassed reason to get up in the morning and face the snow. Pause here and consider the cost. The religion of the doomed gods did not create happiness. It created endurance. It created the kind of poetry that only grief can write. Egil Skallagrimsson's Sonatoric does not end with acceptance. It ends with the poet sitting in a room, alone, having outlived everyone he loved, and saying, "My lineage is ended, like a fallen tree in a forest." And then he stands up and goes on living, because that is what you do when you have placed your hope not in rescue, but in the act of standing up. The Norse did not worship their gods because the gods would save them. They worshiped because the gods were walking the same path, and the path was leading into the dark. You cannot follow a god who has already passed through the dark if you are afraid of what you will find on the other side. The Norse did not turn away. Let the weight of that sit for a moment. Then ask yourself what it means for the way you structure your own hope. Here is the specific anchor you need to carry forward. The year is roughly 980. A Norse woman in Greenland, part of the colony Eric the Red founded, buries her husband in a boat draped with the skin of a polar bear. She places beside him his axe, his comb, his whetstone, and a small bronze crucifix he acquired through trade. The crucifix is intriguing. By 980, Christianity had penetrated the Norse world through raids and trade so deeply that even the dead were buried with two contradictory belief systems. The crucifixes were often placed next to Thor's hammers. The wife is hedging her bets. She is not choosing a winner. She is covering both possibilities, because in her worldview, you do not know which gods will survive Ragnarok. Some sources say a new god and a new world will emerge from the ashes. Others say nothing. She does not take the risk. She sends her husband to the afterlife with a hammer and a cross, and the most heartbreaking detail is that the cross is not a symbol of conversion. It is a talisman of desperation. She is touching both robes because she cannot afford to be wrong. The doomed gods made no promise of certainty. They only promised that the path would not be walked alone. That cross and hammer, buried together in the permafrost for 1,000 years, is the visual that explains the entire religion. The Norse mind was not primitive. It was not simple. It was a landscape of paradox where you held contradictory truths in your hands at the same moment, because the world itself was a contradiction. The gods were powerful and doomed. The afterlife was both a beautiful hall and a gray eternity. The future was both written and unwritten, and you, the farmer, the wife, the warrior, the poet, stood in the middle of those contradictions and made a decision that required no guarantees. You chose to worship the gods who would not save you, not because you were confused, not because you failed to invent a better god, but because the only gods worth worshiping in a world where the wolf is always circling are the ones who know the wolf's name and meet it anyway. That is the inheritance the Norse left the modern world. Not a pantheon, not a cosmology, a stance, a way of facing the winter with your eyes open and your hand on the weapon and your mouth set in a straight line that is not a smile and is not a frown, but is the face of someone who has accepted the terms of the contract and agreed to fight nonetheless. If you have ever felt the urge to brace yourself before good news, to expect the phone call that brings bad tidings, to hold your joy at arm's length because you have learned that hope is a more painful wound than disappointment, that is the echo of Ragnarok in your own nervous system. The Vikings built their entire spiritual architecture around that caution. They knew the wolf was coming. They built their ships anyway. They wrote their poems anyway. They loved their children anyway. And when the wolf came, they did not ask why. They drew their swords and they walked into the dark beside gods who were already dead. You have that same architecture in you. The only question is whether you will use it as the Vikings did, not to shrink from life, but to live it with the kind of ferocity that only a doomed creature can muster.